In today's video, we're going to be looking at an advanced technique to humanize MIDI channels within Ableton Live. And to do this, we'll be using a series of Max for Live modules created by one of my favourite electronic music producers, James Holden. And yep, so let's dive in with this tutorial. So in this project, we've got drums, and this is just a basic simple drum patch using samples from the Audiotent Aurora pack. I'll let you have a quick listen to this. Next, we've got a bass channel set up, and again, I've just used a one shot from the Aurora pack, and I'll let you have a quick listen to this one. And on the third channel, we have a synth loop taken from the Maze pack. And what I did with this one is I basically sliced the loop up into a drum rack, so I could manipulate the MIDI notes a little bit better, and also I could just loop one section and add a groove. So with each of these channels, we've got an MPC 16 Swin 53 groove setup, and that's basically just to make sure that all three, with no humanization applied, are working together nicely. So this is what that sounds like all together. So the loop works great together, it's got a nice groove already, but I want the groove to be a little bit more wonky and a little bit more human sounding. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the Group Humaniser plugin by James Holden to achieve that. So if you go to the Max for Live website and just search for Group Humaniser, you'll download this folder here, and within there you've got some documentation which will show you how to use the plugin in a little bit more depth, and it's also got some a description at the top of why he made the plugin and what it essentially does. And within these folders you've got the Max audio effect, so that's with that if you want to include a human element, like an outside element, so an audio source. James Holden has a live drummer, and basically this Max for Live plugin listens to the real world drummer and responds to him. And then we've got the Max MIDI effects plugins. So the ones that we'll be using will mainly be Slave and the Master. So if you take the Master, I've already set this up already just to save time, because it's quite a lengthy process, but I'll talk you through it. So if you drop the Group Humaniser Master on the Master channel, ignore these MIDI clips, I'll show you why I've done them later. And then if you drop a Slave on each of the MIDI channels, so if we go in, you can see I've got the Master on this one, and I've got the Slaves all set up on these MIDI channels. So on the Master channel, we've got this Group Humaniser Master module, and within this module, we've got a few different parameters to play around with. So the first one is timing error, and if you just hover over those, they will actually pop up with this sticky note here, and that basically just gives you an insight into what that does, and also gives you a few tips on where to set the value to get the best results. So yeah, the timing error is like the deviations in timing off the grid. And then the second one is motor error, so this is like humanistic motor errors. The third one is listening, so these values represent how much each of those channels is listening to the other channel or the player, for instance. And then also we've got influence, so this value determines how much influence each of those MIDI channels has on the other MIDI channel. So essentially with these parameters, what's happening is these three channels are kind of listening to each other and playing with each other as a band would. So then you get this constantly kind of like moving and drifting of timing and little humanistic errors, which you can set quite subtle, or you can experiment a little bit and push to the extremes. So I'm going to show you a little example of how this works. So within these MIDI notes, we've got no humanization at the top, and the second one we've got subtle humanization, which I set up because I felt that this would be the best settings for this particular groove, because I don't want it to have too much of an effect on the errors, because we're making club music, and basically you want to keep that kind of solid groove going. And then the third one is expert players. So this is what James Holden and his team determined as the millisecond values of how the settings of how expert players would play. So it's like having an expert band play. If you're making quite organic, loose music, that's a really, really good setting to go for. But again, because we're making quite solid club music, I don't want to use this effect too much. And then the fourth one is worst band ever. So that's basically settings that will just make it sound like really, really bad, to be honest. But I'll start with this and it'll show you an extreme example of what this plugin is doing. So it's very loose, very wonky, and very, very undesirable in my eyes and ears. So yeah, you can see what it's done here. You can see the deviations show up on the graphs here. And if you go over to the other plugins, you can see the readouts here. So these are like timing errors and things like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to play around with this, and I'm going to go through the different settings we've got here to show you what effects that has on the original groove and how nice it sounds when it's just like a subtle version of that. So there's another little thing that I would like to bring up as well. So this self-regulation mode here, by default it'll be switched on to adjust Ableton clock. So that means that the plugin will be adjusting the nudge parameters of Ableton, so it'll be like constantly nudging the clock. Again, because we're making club music, I would stick this on metronome. So it means that the master is listening to the metronome of Ableton Live rather than Ableton listening to the Group Humaniser master plugin. So yep, now we've got that metronome. I'm going to flick from no humanization to subtle and take a look at these readouts as well and where I've got them. So I don't know if you can hear that, but it's like a little bit more loose, a little bit more wonky. It's very subtle, but I feel like it gives grooves sometimes a little bit more character and a little bit more movement rather than just a static groove. And then I'll just click on expert players as well, because that's a little bit more, there's a little bit more of the effect happening, but I'll show you that. So for me, that's a little bit too much, to be honest, and I'm going to stick with subtle. Another little tip when working with this plugin is that if you go into the MIDI clips, when you normally input MIDI notes, it takes up this whole space, and when you put in the next one, the end point and the beginning point are touching. It states in the manual that you should make sure you have a little bit of a gap between the end point and start point of the next note. I found this out myself when I didn't do this, and I realised that the plugin wasn't working as well. And basically it's an error that they can't get around at the moment, which is that it doesn't recognise the next note. It carries on the effect of the first note into the second note. So yeah, when dealing with this, just make sure that you select all and just pull the MIDI notes back a little bit. If you want the sound to carry on all the way up to the beginning of the next note, then simply just go into, for instance here, just go into the simpler and just turn the release up. So it means that when the note finishes, it'll carry on for a little bit longer. So there you go, there's an advanced technique that I like to use when trying to humanize my Ableton projects and get things sounding a little bit looser, a little bit more wonky. It's not always a desirable effect if you're making like quite pounding straight techno. But if you've got a track that is lending itself to like a more organic feel, then this is definitely a great technique to test out and try out on your own projects, which yields much better results than just sticking randomizers on each MIDI channel. Lastly, have you guys got any plugins or go-to techniques that are similar to this one? Please share with us in the comment section below. I would really appreciate that. And also, what are your thoughts on humanizing electronic and club music? Is it something that we should be striving for? Or do you believe that grooves work better when things are a little bit more solid and a little bit more static? I would love to hear your thoughts on that. So again, please drop us a comment and we will get back to you. Thank you for tuning in.